WNC Lyceum investigates traditional culture and attitudes in Western North Carolina. We uncover how existing authority structures stifle dissent, deter the search for knowledge, and hold back our communities. We accept the reality of power, take action, and encourage the use of power to do good. Today I'm going to talk about telling accurate history. Citizens have a right to critique and judge monuments that elected officials place on public property. If we're going to erect monuments that purport to teach history, let's tell a more accurate history, and let's not mislabel the monuments. Take the monument labeled Charters of Freedom, installed on the plaza of our historic courthouse in Henderson County in September 2018. The monument displays copies of the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. It's a facsimile of the Charters of Freedom monument that's been on display in the Capitol Rotunda in Washington, D.C. since 1952. The display should be labeled simply Our Founding Documents, not Charters of Freedom. It's a matter of accuracy. For Americans at the time, millions were not guaranteed anything by the founding documents, much less freedom. Freedom doesn't have any practical meaning if one doesn't have equal protection of the law to pursue one's freedom. That's exactly what millions of Americans were denied at the time of the founding, equal protection of the law. In a moment, I'll tell you some of the history that's been neglected and should be acknowledged. But first, let's go back to the monument dedication ceremony in Henderson County. According to the Hendersonville Lightning, 9/19/2018, a local newspaper, Henderson County officials on Wednesday dedicated the new display of America's founding documents at the historic Courthouse Plaza with speeches, a cannon salute, an honor guard, and patriotic music. The ceremony included music by the West Henderson High School Band, a welcome by County Commission Chair Mike Ledney, invocation by Commissioner Tommy Thompson, Pledge of Allegiance led by Commissioner Grady Hawkins, recognition of other elected officials by Commissioner Bill Lapsley, and acceptance of the exhibit by Commissioner Charlie Messer. Earlier, the commissioners, in a bulletin, had encouraged the public to attend the Charters of Freedom dedication ceremony to enjoy the educational experience of reading these documents that secure the freedom and rights of the citizens of the United States. The bulletin added that the ceremony would include the placement of articles in a time capsule accompanied by a cannon volley. With such an elaborate emphasis on education, we should note that millions of Americans at the time were not guaranteed anything by the founding documents because they were denied equal protection of the law, and thus not able to take advantage of the opportunities freely offered to others. They were charters of freedom for some, not for all. The display of our founding documents as charters of freedom is surely sincere and well-meaning, but we must acknowledge they are incomplete, because in reality, millions had to fight their way uphill against great odds, risking their lives and families, and giving their lives struggling against the status quo represented by the Constitution, which at the time denied millions of Americans equal protection of the law. An incomplete history, therefore, is misleading. We must have a fuller understanding of who was denied freedom and equal protection of the law at the time. To begin, let's talk about the 4 million enslaved African Americans who built much of the wealth of the country and whose labor was stolen from them for 250 years. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were designed to begin the remediation of 250 years of theft and enslavement. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment guaranteed citizenship and equal protection of the laws to the formerly enslaved. The 15th Amendment guaranteed the vote to black males. First, we have to understand that these constitutional amendments wouldn't have been possible without the 4-year American Civil War costing over 600,000 lives, which was necessary to break the power of the Southern slaveholders. And as historian Eric Foner writes in The Second Founding, even after these amendments were passed, they were not fully implemented because the Supreme Court narrowed their interpretation, while Southern legislatures actively undermined them. This was the beginning of the Jim Crow system. What were the consequences of Jim Crow in the South? Isabel Wilkerson writes about the 20th century migration of blacks from the South in her prize-winning book, The Warmth of Other Suns. Between 1915 and 1970, about 6 million African Americans left their southern homeland on buses, trains, and automobiles and headed out west to the Midwest and Northeast to escape the oppression of Southern Jim Crow laws and practices. Rigged juries, white mob violence, lynchings, beatings, cheating on wages, obsessive and senseless segregation, relentless harassment by white people. That is what millions of African Americans had to fight through in an attempt to get their equal rights. But upon their escape from the South, millions still found themselves cheated out of fair housing and jobs on account of government-sanctioned segregation and discrimination. Millions were denied equal benefits from the GI Bill and Social Security. As a consequence, African Americans were denied the opportunity to build generational wealth to benefit their families and to pass on to descendants. There was no equal protection of the law for these Americans. American blacks did not have legal citizenship rights and equal protection of the law assumed by others until 100 years after the end of the Civil War, with the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the 1965 Voting Rights Act, and the 1968 Fair Housing Act. But even these acts of Congress did not undo the accumulated wealth disadvantage of black families caused by centuries of previous legal discrimination. The disadvantage of unequal wealth accumulation still exists today for black families. Let's tell a more complete history. Stony the road we trod, bitter the chastening rod, felt in the days when hope unborn had died, according to the anthem by James Weldon Johnson. Let's go on to 3 other amendments that were necessary to expand freedom and protection of the law for people not included in the original Constitution. The 17th Amendment expanded democracy by allowing the popular election of senators who were formerly appointed by state legislatures. Imagine now not being free to elect your own U.S. senators. The 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote in 1919. The 24th Amendment, ratified in 1964, almost 100 years after the Civil War, abolished the poll tax that was used to prevent Southern blacks from voting. American Indians didn't get American citizenship until 1924. In her book, How the South Won the Civil War, historian Heather Cox Richardson details the long and extensive abuse and discrimination against Mexican and Chinese workers in the settling of the American West. In 1941, after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, the U.S. government put 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry into detention camps. Most of these people were American citizens or residing here legally. They were held in remote camps for up to 4 years. There was no equal protection of the law for them. Before 1974 and the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, a bank could refuse a credit card to an unmarried woman. If a woman was married, she still needed her husband to co-sign. It wasn't until 1978 that a woman would be safe from being fired because she became pregnant. The Pregnancy Discrimination Act prohibited such sexual discrimination on the basis of pregnancy. In 1980, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission determined that sexual harassment was a form of sex discrimination subject to legal action. It took a Supreme Court decision, Griswold versus Connecticut, to give married women the right to contraceptives. In a 7-2 decision in 1965, the Supreme Court ruled that the Constitution protected the right of marital privacy against state restrictions on contraception. Single women did not gain the right to obtain birth control until the 1972 Supreme Court decision, Eisenstadt versus Baird. Gay people did not have marriage equality until 2015 with the narrow 5-4 Supreme Court Obergefell decision in favor of gay marriage and equal protection of the law. We can acknowledge the promise and possibilities in our country without being blind to the past. In August 1963, in his speech at the Great March on Washington, Martin Luther King Jr. said, "When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned." King continued, "Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds." King was assassinated in 1968 while supporting striking sanitation workers in Memphis, Tennessee. He was 39 years old. The original Constitution and Bill of Rights were a charter of freedom for some, but a bad check for others. Let's admit the bad check and not ignore other people's history and ignore their contribution to making their way to freedom against an oppressive system. But the past is often invoked to cheerlead for a narrative that denies the reality of the historic unequal treatment before the law. To suggest that our founding documents by themselves gave all Americans freedom is a denial of history. We can expose this weak and misleading history. We have to acknowledge the history that has been neglected and often mistold. We can educate students and the public by giving them a better, more complete history. Today is January 28th, 2023. Thank you for listening. Please like, share, and subscribe. Remember, it's easier to take risks when you know it's not all about you. Stay close to your local community, find out how things work, and help create a world that works for everybody.